But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, Geddes was riding high on a wave of public support and media attention. His follower count was growing daily, his live streams were drawing massive audiences, and donations were pouring into his various fundraising accounts from people who believed they were supporting the effort to bring 2 missing children home. It seemed like he had pulled off the perfect deception. What he didn't realize was that his moment of greatest triumph had also marked the beginning of his downfall. While Darin Geddes was basking in the glow of viral fame following the leaked audio incident, a very different kind of attention was beginning to focus on his activities. Deep within the RCMP's major crime unit, investigators were starting to ask the kinds of questions that Geddes had hoped no one would think to ask. It started with routine due diligence. When someone claims to have breakthrough information in a high-profile missing persons case, professional investigators don't simply take that person at their word. They investigate the investigator. Detective Sergeant Lisa Morrison had been working missing persons cases for over 15 years, and something about Geddes' claims had been bothering her from the beginning. It wasn't just the convenient timing of his revelations or the way he seemed to always have just enough information to maintain interest without providing anything actionable. It was something more fundamental, something about the way his story didn't quite align with the realities of how investigations actually work. When someone claims to have found missing children but won't tell us where they are, that's not protecting the children, Morrison would later explain to her colleagues. That's protecting the person making the claim. So while Geddes was conducting his live streams and building his online following, Morrison and her team were conducting a very different kind of investigation. One focused not on finding Lily and Jack, but on understanding exactly who Darin Geddes was and whether his claims could withstand professional scrutiny. The first red flag came when they examined the metadata from the leaked audio clip. Modern digital forensics can extract remarkable amounts of information from audio files, not just voice patterns and background noise, but technical details about when and where the recording was made, what devices were used, and how the file was processed after the initial recording. What they found was immediately suspicious. The audio had been created using professional editing software, the kind typically used by podcasters and content creators rather than someone secretly recording sensitive communications. More importantly, the timestamp data showed that the file had been created and edited multiple times over a period of several hours, which was inconsistent with the story of a spontaneous, secretly recorded conversation. But it was the voice analysis that provided the most damning evidence. When audio experts compared the leaked recording to samples of Geddes' known speech patterns from his live streams, they found perfect matches not just for vocal characteristics, but for specific phrases and speech patterns. The leaked audio wasn't a secretly recorded conversation. It was Geddes talking to himself, probably reading from a script he had written specifically to create the impression of a clandestine communication. Armed with this information, Morrison's team began digging deeper into Geddes' digital footprint, and what they found painted a picture of deception that went far beyond a single manipulated audio file. Cell phone tower data provided the most concrete evidence of Geddes' dishonesty. Every cell phone continuously communicates with nearby towers, creating a digital trail of location data that can be subpoenaed and analyzed by law enforcement. When Morrison's team obtained Geddes' location data for May 2nd, the day Lily and Jack disappeared, they discovered something that completely contradicted his later claims. According to his phone's digital footprint, Geddes had been nowhere near Lanceville Station on the day the children vanished. In fact, his phone had been pinging towers near Halifax, more than 250 kilometers away from the Sullivan family property. This might have been explainable if Geddes had simply been wrong about dates or had traveled to the search area later. But when investigators compared the timestamp of his supposed breakthrough in locating the children with his actual whereabouts, they found that he had been conducting a live stream from his Halifax home at the exact moment he later claimed to have been coordinating rescue operations in the wilderness. The mathematics were simple and damning. It was physically impossible for Geddes to have been in 2 places at once. But the cell phone data revealed something even more troubling. When investigators analyzed Geddes' location patterns over the weeks following the children's disappearance, they found that he had never actually visited the search area. Despite his claims of coordinating on-the-ground volunteer efforts and having direct knowledge of the terrain, the data showed that he had spent the entire time in his Halifax apartment, venturing out only for routine activities like grocery shopping and visiting local coffee shops. Every dramatic claim about coordinating search efforts, every detailed description of terrain features, every insider knowledge about the search that he had shared with his thousands of followers, all of it had been fabricated by someone who had never set foot in the actual search area. Digital forensics investigators then turned their attention to Geddes' online activities, and what they found revealed the true scope of his deception. Analysis of his internet search history showed a pattern of research that aligned perfectly with his public claims about the case. He had spent hours researching Nova Scotia geography, studying maps of the Lanceville Station area, and reading every publicly available news report about the search efforts. But more disturbing were his searches for information about how missing persons investigations work, what kinds of evidence investigators look for, and how to avoid detection when creating fake social media accounts. The investigation revealed that Geddes had created multiple fake online personas that he used to boost his own credibility and attack his critics. These sock puppet accounts would appear in his live stream comments to ask leading questions that allowed him to share information he wanted to disseminate. They would defend him in online discussions and attack anyone who questioned his methods or motives. Perhaps most cynically, some of these fake accounts posed as family members of other missing persons, lending their supposed authority to validate Geddes' claims about his investigative methods. The technical evidence was building into an overwhelming case that Geddes was not just wrong about his claims, he was deliberately lying about them. But investigators still needed to understand the why behind his deceptions. What motivated someone to insert themselves into a tragic situation and build an elaborate lie around the suffering of a family they had never met? The answer, as they would soon discover, lay in following the money. Financial records showed that Geddes had been struggling economically before the Sullivan case made him famous. He had been unemployed for several months, was behind on rent, and had maxed out multiple credit cards. His expensive streaming equipment and professional setup weren't evidence of his commitment to the case. They were investments in what he apparently saw as a business opportunity. As his online following grew, so did his income. Donations that were supposedly going to fund search efforts were actually being deposited into his personal accounts. Merchandise sales, premium membership tiers for his online content, and even book deal inquiries were generating revenue that transformed his financial situation. The missing children case had literally rescued Geddes from poverty, giving him both income and purpose. From his perspective, keeping the story alive, keeping hope alive, wasn't just about maintaining his audience. It was about maintaining his livelihood. But as the investigators would soon learn, Geddes had made one crucial mistake that would ultimately expose not just his deceptions, but his knowledge of what had really happened to Lily and Jack Sullivan. He had recorded himself confessing to the truth. And that recording was about to surface in the most damaging possible way. If you're finding this case as disturbing as I am, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. Cases like this show us how easily tragedy can be exploited, and the more people who understand these patterns, the better we can protect vulnerable families in the future. Inside the sterile conference rooms of RCMP headquarters in Halifax, a debate was raging that would ultimately determine Darin Geddes' fate. The evidence against him was mounting, but the question of how to proceed was complicated by factors that went far beyond simple criminal prosecution. Detective Sergeant Lisa Morrison had compiled a comprehensive file on Geddes' activities, but when she presented her findings to the major crime unit leadership, she found herself facing an unexpected dilemma. The case against Geddes was strong, but acting on it carried risks that extended far beyond a single prosecution. "We're not just dealing with fraud or obstruction," Morrison explained to her supervisor, Inspector David Chin. "We're dealing with someone who has built a massive public platform around false claims about missing children. If we arrest him and we're wrong, we destroy our credibility. If we arrest him and we're right, we potentially destroy the public's faith in the investigation itself." It was a delicate balance. Geddes had become such a central figure in public discussions about the Sullivan case that any action against him would inevitably be seen as either validation of his claims or persecution of someone trying to help. Either outcome carried the potential to derail the actual search for Lily and Jack. The first internal memo addressing the Geddes situation was dated June 28, 3 days after the leaked audio had made him a viral sensation. Marked confidential, internal distribution only. It outlined the legal framework for potential charges against someone who had interfered with an ongoing investigation. Subject: obstruction of justice. Criminal Code Section 139. This memo addresses the potential application of obstruction of justice charges in relation to an individual who has disseminated unverified and potentially false information regarding an ongoing missing persons investigation. Section 139(1) of the Criminal Code states that everyone who willfully attempts in any manner to obstruct, pervert, or defeat the course of justice in a judicial proceeding is guilty of an indictable offense and liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 10 years. While the subject's actions do not occur within formal judicial proceedings, legal precedent supports the application of obstruction charges when an individual's conduct materially interferes with police investigations, particularly when such conduct involves deliberate deception and results in the misallocation of investigative resources. The memo went on to detail how Geddes' claims had indeed resulted in the misallocation of resources. Based on his public statements, search teams had spent hundreds of hours investigating leads that appeared to be based on his supposed inside knowledge. Volunteer groups had organized expeditions to areas that Geddes had identified as significant, diverting manpower from more promising search zones identified by professional investigators. More seriously, the memo noted that some volunteers had put themselves in danger following Geddes' guidance, venturing into treacherous terrain during nighttime searches based on his claims that the children were hidden in specific locations. The subject's conduct has not only wasted investigative resources, but has actively endangered civilian volunteers and potentially compromised the safety of the missing children by directing search efforts away from areas identified through professional investigative techniques, the memo concluded. But even as the legal case for obstruction charges was being developed, a second memo was circulating that focused on different criminal provisions that might apply to Geddes' conduct. Subject: mischief charges. Criminal Code Section 430. This memo examines the application of mischief charges against an individual whose conduct has endangered life through the dissemination of false information in a missing persons case. Section 430(1) of the Criminal Code addresses mischief that endangers life, stating that everyone commits mischief who willfully c. obstructs, interrupts, or interferes with the lawful use, enjoyment, or operation of property, or d. obstructs, interrupts, or interferes with any person in the lawful use, enjoyment, or operation of property. While mischief charges typically apply to property crimes, legal advisors have determined that the subject's conduct falls within the scope of these provisions when considering the broader definition of property to include public resources and safety infrastructure. The memo detailed how Geddes' false claims had not only misdirected official search efforts, but had also compromised the safety of volunteer searchers. His guidance had led groups into dangerous terrain during nighttime operations, creating situations where rescue resources had to be diverted from searching for the children to ensuring the safety of misguided volunteers. The subject's conduct has created a secondary emergency situation, the memo noted, wherein search and rescue resources must be allocated to protect civilians who have been deliberately misdirected into dangerous situations based on false information. The mischief charges were considered particularly applicable because they didn't require proof that Geddes had intended to harm the children directly, only that his willful dissemination of false information had created dangerous situations and interfered with lawful operations. But perhaps the most damning internal document was a third memo that focused on conspiracy charges. Subject: criminal conspiracy. Criminal Code Section 465. This memo addresses potential conspiracy charges against an individual who has allegedly coordinated with unknown parties to obstruct a missing persons investigation while soliciting financial benefit from the deception. The conspiracy memo was based on evidence that Geddes had not been acting alone. Digital forensics had identified several social media accounts that appeared to be coordinating with Geddes to amplify his message and attack his critics. While investigators had not yet identified all the individuals behind these accounts, the coordinated nature of their activities suggested a broader network of deception. More significantly, financial records showed that Geddes had been sharing donation revenues with at least two other individuals whose identities remained under investigation. This suggested that the deception had been organized as a profit-sharing enterprise rather than the work of a single misguided individual. The evidence suggests a coordinated effort to exploit public sympathy for missing children in order to generate financial profit while simultaneously obstructing legitimate search efforts, the memo concluded. This conduct falls clearly within the definition of criminal conspiracy, as outlined in Section 465 of the Criminal Code. As these memos circulated through RCMP leadership, the debate over how to proceed intensified. Some argued for immediate action, claiming that every day Geddes remained free was another day that resources were being wasted and the real investigation was being compromised. Others counseled patience, arguing that arresting Geddes without absolute certainty could backfire spectacularly if the public perceived the action as persecution of someone trying to help find the children. The debate reached a turning point when Inspector Chen received a call from RCMP Commissioner Jennifer Morrison, no relation to Detective Sergeant Lisa Morrison. The commissioner had been fielding calls from politicians, journalists, and advocacy groups, all demanding to know what the RCMP was doing about the growing influence of amateur investigators in high-profile cases. "We need to send a message," the commissioner told Chen during a secure conference call that included senior leadership from multiple RCMP divisions. "The message needs to be that we don't tolerate interference with investigations, especially when that interference puts children at risk." But even as the decision to move forward with charges was being made at the highest levels, investigators were uncovering evidence that would make the case against Geddes even stronger than they had initially realized. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Geddes himself. While analyzing the contents of his various electronic devices, digital forensic specialists had discovered a folder labeled Personal Audio Notes that contained dozens of voice recordings that Geddes had apparently made for himself over the course of several months. Most of these recordings were routine, grocery lists, reminders about appointments, thoughts about his streaming content. But buried among the mundane entries was a recording that would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case against him. In the recording, made just 3 weeks after Lily and Jack's disappearance, Geddes could be heard speaking to himself in the privacy of his apartment. "I know exactly what happened that morning. They're not out there. I cover for them. I can't untangle this now. But as long as people believe they're alive, as long as people keep hoping, they keep watching, they keep donating, they keep believing in me." The recording continued for several more minutes, with Geddes outlining his strategy for maintaining public interest in the case, while avoiding any claims specific enough to be definitively disproven. "The key is to always be just about to reveal something," he said in the recording. "Always on the verge of a breakthrough. Give them enough hope to keep them engaged, but never enough information that they stop needing me." The recording was devastating evidence of deliberate deception, but it was also something more troubling. It suggested that Geddes had specific knowledge about what had actually happened to Lily and Jack Sullivan. When Detective Sergeant Morrison first heard the recording, her blood ran cold. Geddes wasn't just exploiting the case for profit. He was covering up information about the children's fate while pretending to search for them. He says, "I know exactly what happened that morning, and I cover for them," Morrison explained to her colleagues. "This isn't just obstruction anymore. This suggests he has direct knowledge of what happened to these children and is actively concealing it." The discovery of the confession recording accelerated the timeline for Geddes' arrest dramatically. What had been a careful, methodical investigation suddenly became an urgent operation to apprehend someone who might hold the key to solving the case. But it also raised terrifying new questions. If Geddes knew what had happened to Lily and Jack, why was he covering it up? Who was he protecting? And most importantly, were the children still alive, or had Geddes been perpetuating false hope while knowing they were already beyond rescue? As the arrest warrants were being finalized, investigators realized they weren't just dealing with someone who had exploited a tragedy. They were potentially dealing with someone who was an accessory to whatever had happened to 2 missing children. The internal memos that had started as legal analyses of interference charges had evolved into something much more serious: the foundation for a case that could involve kidnapping, conspiracy, and potentially even more serious charges, depending on what Geddes' confession recordings ultimately revealed. And as word began to leak through RCMP headquarters that an arrest was imminent, the pressure to act quickly intensified. Because if Geddes realized that investigators had discovered his confession recordings, there was no telling what desperate actions he might take to protect himself and whoever he had been covering for. The hunt for Darin Geddes was about to begin. And with it, the hope that the truth about Lily and Jack Sullivan would finally be revealed. While RCMP investigators were building their case against Darin Geddes behind closed doors, the court of public opinion was becoming increasingly vocal about the perceived failures of the official investigation. Social media had transformed the Sullivan case into something far beyond a local missing persons investigation. It had become a national obsession that was putting unprecedented pressure on law enforcement to deliver results. The irony was devastating. The same public platforms that Geddes had used to build his deceptive empire were now being used by genuine advocates to demand accountability from the very people who were working to expose him. It started with a Facebook group called Justice for Lily and Jack Sullivan, created by family friend Maria Santos, who had grown frustrated with what she perceived as the RCMP's lack of transparency about the investigation's progress. Santos had no way of knowing that her well-intentioned advocacy was actually putting pressure on investigators at the worst possible moment, just as they were preparing to take down the person who had been manipulating the case from the beginning.